All right, thank you very much. Thanks to the organizers and judges. It's an honor to be here. I have 3 policy pitches based on my recorded presentation on higher education student migration. So student migration is important because it creates repeated waves of human capital movement every year. We know that at the provincial level, 10% of higher education students migrate to attend school. As my presentation showed, at the CMA level, the rate increases to 27.4%. For my policy pitch, the first pertains to local economic development and human capital. As Richard Florida said, regions should attract creative people or die. This speaks to the underpinning importance of human capital in local economic development, as evidenced in many economics and social science-related disciplines. Universities play a key role in talent attraction and retention. One of such ways at the regional level is through institutional coordination, as exemplified by Liverpool's 2003 work in Kitchener-Cambridge Waterloo. The second policy is data strategy and policy. This gives us a first view of the national picture of student migration in Canada. This is a large movement of about 200,000 people crossing provincial boundaries annually. However, as argued by Larry Orton, Canada needs comprehensive data to aid student migration research and policy. One of the gaps I identified in pieces is the missing information of students who studied in Quebec, which is the second most populous province in Canada with about 91 higher education institutions. Therefore, as a specific policy recommendation, Statistics Canada should show up the strength in pieces and continue to enhance its linkage to other data sets. This finally leads me to a federalist policy coordination for student migration. As my presentation revealed, the parallel systems of higher education in Canada are integrated through student migration. It also reveals other issues such as student information, transportability of fees and funding, articulation and credential recognition, also hidden in the cracks of federalism. This calls for a robust policy role for federalist coordination, and we constitute this policy in the federal government, but also the Council of Federation, which is a forum that promotes interprovincial territorial cooperation, and perhaps a more direct forum is the Council of Ministers of Education, given their interest in issues pertaining to student fees, access and affordability, and more. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So first judge this time will be Claudia.
Hi, thanks very much for that. Was very exciting to see this new data set being used in your research. I'm a health researcher by training, not education. I learned a lot from your presentation, so thank you. I'm going to be a little selfish here and ask a StatCan-oriented question, but as this is a new data set, I'm wondering if, again, you've got the chief statistician there, what would your recommendations be in terms of more information or new information, data variables you would like to add to this very rich data set in order to further your research and the research of others in this area?
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. It's a great question. So there is evidence in the literature that talks about the importance of student background. So for instance, if we have information pertaining to their parental education or parental income, for instance, it can help. But I'm aware that pieces is being linked to tax files, so we can have information of students who have actually studied and moved on to graduate, and then we can try and then look at whether students who move earn more, or whether, as to whether there is any value at all in migrating. And there are other issues that we could also look at in terms of the residences where students actually live during their studies, because it's also important. There is the literature on studentification, which talks about areas or places being transformed because of students moving in. So if you could have information on whether the students, whether it was a student resident, whether it was off campus, the nature of the residence will also help in terms of further analysis in linkage to the pieces. So I hope I've answered the question.
All right, take it away, Monica.
Thank you so much for your presentation. The question I have is related to the area of study and the migration of the students, and also in undergraduate versus graduate studies, and if you've given any thought into diving deeper into that. So if a student is leaving and migrating across country, is it for a particular faculty, a particular area of study, or again, just on location?
Yes, thank you so much for the question. It's something that I actually did by doing the STEM split. So I split the overall flow metrics by STEM to see whether students migrate in preference to STEM disciplines or non-STEM disciplines. But for now, in pieces, what we have in terms of the program of study, we don't have for whether it's for science or for engineering only. We only know it's STEM based or non-STEM based. So if we can have specifics in terms of that, that could also help to know which of the individual faculties the students are actually migrating or not migrating to study, because it's also important that where we know the reasons students move and the reasons students stay, so that, for example, giving my policy recommendation for universities to attract, if we know, for instance, that students prefer to move for non-STEM based disciplines, then we can do policies that are geared towards attracting students that prefer STEM disciplines, for example.
Okay, Hugh.
Thank you very much for that. I enjoyed your presentation. I'm wondering about the longer term impacts of attracting human capital into a certain city or location, and if you were to have to kind of make a pitch to Ottawa Mayor Jim Watson to say you should be investing in this to try to attract more higher educated, some of these STEM professionals, how would you approach that and say, how could you quantify the benefit of having students come in and live for a year, 2 years, 5 years, things like that?
Yeah, thank you so much for the question. I think there is literature in economics, as I mentioned, and social science related disciplines that have really documented the importance of human capital, which is fundamental to local economic development. So, but beyond that, you can also look at local spending for students, purchasing goods and services, for example, which is also important for local economies to grow. So in terms of quantifying what the impact of attracting students would be, if you look at Richard Florida's creative class theory, for instance, it shows how it's important to have a diverse group of people together who bring in ideas, and then you also add to your labor pool. So those are things that are also important for economies to grow, because now there's an emergence of the creative class, and then there's a talent and knowledge economy coming up. So we need to really capitalize and take advantage of the creative people, talented people to grow the economy.
Okay, Umit?
Yeah, thanks very much, Ebenezer. This is a very interesting research problem you have. Definitely policy relevant, but I think all that gets amplified even maybe tenfold, I'd say, or maybe more when you lay on the same problem, the international students phenomena. Because the competition is not only inside Canada, the movement is not only inside Canada, it's a global movement. And this is increasing tremendously. I'm sure you must have looked at those numbers, international students incoming. And of course, they choose and they go one university versus another. That means one province for another. So given this growing importance of international students for the post-secondary, I'm talking about K-12 is there, but let's not go there. Post-secondary education institutions. So how can they be included? How would you see that layering on top of this problem that you have described? Because data is there, is available. And what would you anticipate in that type of an equation, which is slightly larger and more complex?
Yeah, thank you so much for the question. So I would like to say, in my project that I did for this particular presentation, when it got to the sample selection, I excluded international students because I was looking at internal migration of students. So fortunately, we can have this group of people also analyzed in pieces, which is good. So specifically to your question, there is literature, I think Green 2013, that talks about students who prefer, immigrants who have preference to places where there are other immigrants, because it symbolizes the fact that there is this welcoming environment for them. So when we are looking at immigrants coming into Canada through being international students, we can also consider them what would make international students stay, or whether when they come in through any particular institution, whether they move further to other provinces or CMA for that matter, or whether they also move onward to other countries. And that's one of the research that I'm also interested in doing beyond the internal analysis, that I also want to see how the movements of international students are, and we can do this by layering it with country of origin, ethnicity, and then we can even look at whether they are visible minority groups and all that. So yeah, thank you so much for the question, and it's interesting and something that we could do with future research.
Okay, and Tammy?
Okay, thank you. So I really enjoyed this idea of thinking about things at the CMA level. I think that's a huge contribution to bring into this literature. And it's also makes it a bit more difficult, though, to think about movements between CMAs and across provinces as two dimensions to this for policy, right? Because education is the provincial policy. But the other thing that was really hard to wrap my head around here was just distance and how distance matters, right? There's a big difference between my students who commute between Toronto and Kitchener every day, migrating between those two CMAs, and the student who goes from, Whitehorse to Winnipeg, right? These are very, very different situations. So I'm wondering if maybe you can tell me how the work you've done, or what maybe needs to be done, to tell us more about what's needed for those different types of distances between CMAs.
Yeah, so thank you so much for the question. And it's one of the things I actually thought about when I was using pieces, because in defining migration is actually the relocation of people. So there should be an actual measurement of residential change, whereby the person moves from one place to another. So commuting and daily movements is not what I'm trying to analyze over here. Unfortunately, in pieces, what we have is the postal codes of students' place of origins, and then we can look at it and then imagine it as where they went to study and then think they migrated. But it could be that they were actually virtual migrants. And by virtual migrants, I mean they were doing distance learning or they were studying online and not necessarily have migrated. So if we could have data that shows, if we had in the information of where the students actually lived during the duration of their studies, that will also be important. And for that, once we have that, then it means that we can simply get the distances that have been traveled, and we can do a gravity model to analyze this. I've actually done a gravity model, which I talked about in future research, that we can do a gravity model to see the influence of distance on the movements. Of course, Frenet has done a work on the impact of distance. He talks about students preferring to move when the distance is about 40 to 80 kilometers, and then the flows decreases as the distance increases beyond 80 plus kilometers. So, but Frenet based this on the movements of labor and not necessarily students. Mostly, when it comes to student migration, it is hidden under the shadows of labor movement. And I'm trying to also bring it out to make people see that student migration is also unique from labor movement, although they are potential labor migrants. But at the moment, they are students and there are different variables that are affecting their movement, although it could be similar to that of labor migration. So I would be happy to have that particular information so that I also do an analysis to see what the actual distance is for students who prefer to move, and whether it's also, whether it's 80 kilometers or beyond, and so on and so forth. So thank you so much for the question.